Under the white lights of a Manhattan charity gala, Sebastian Hale raised his hand and struck his pregnant wife in front of a room that knew better and chose silence. Glasses paused midair. Conversations died without sound. Tracy Bryant did not cry. She did not speak. Her hand rested gently over her stomach, her gaze lowered as if the moment did not belong to him at all. At the far edge of the room, an older man watched without moving, without intervening, because what was about to unfold had already begun long before this night. If you believe silence doesn't always mean weakness, stay with this story until the end. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. And if stories of truth and consequence matter to you, consider subscribing. Before anyone ever called her Mrs. Hale, before her name appeared beside Sebastian's, in carefully curated headlines, Tracy Bryant had already learned how to sit in silence without being overlooked. It was a skill that did not come from submission, but from observation. She had been raised in a way that left few public traces. There were no childhood interviews, no social media footprints, no charity boards bearing her family name. Even among New York's old money circles where lineage was currency, Tracy's background remained politely undefined. People described her as private, which was the word they used when they did not have access. What they did not know was that Tracy had been taught early that information had weight, and that speaking too soon often meant giving it away. So she watched. She watched people the way others listened to music patiently, repeatedly, until patterns revealed themselves. By the time she met Sebastian Hale, she already understood how power moved in a room. Sebastian, on the other hand, preferred to announce it. He was the kind of man who had built himself from nothing and made sure no one ever forgot it. His company, Hale Capital, had grown from aggressive early investments into a sprawling financial empire, with influence that reached across markets and into political conversations. He was respected, feared, and, when necessary, admired. But above all, he was in control. At least, that was how it appeared. Their meeting had been arranged through mutual connections, though the details were never entirely clear. Some said it was at a private dinner hosted by investors. Others claimed it was during a quiet charity event where neither of them had intended to stay long. However it happened, Sebastian had noticed Tracy immediately, not because she tried to be seen, but because she did not. She did not compete for attention. She did not perform charm. She listened, and when she spoke, it was precise. He found that intriguing. She found him predictable. Still, the relationship progressed quickly, at least on the surface. Invitations became shared appearances. Shared appearances became photographs. Photographs became speculation, and speculation eventually became confirmation. Within a year, they were married. To the public, it was a perfect alignment. A self-made billionaire and a poised, elegant woman with just enough mystery to invite fascination. The wedding itself had been carefully managed, exclusive but visible, intimate but documented. Every image released told a controlled story, success, stability, and a future that seemed unshakable. But behind that image, the structure of their marriage had been defined much earlier and not equally. Sebastian believed in systems. In his world, everything had a place, a purpose, and a hierarchy. Relationships were no different. At first, the control appeared as consideration. He arranged her schedule so she would not be overwhelmed. He introduced her to key figures so she would be protected. He ensured she had access to everything she needed, which was not the same as everything that existed. Gradually, the boundaries narrowed. Tracy did not have direct access to their primary financial accounts. There were explanations for that: security, efficiency, complexity. Sebastian handled those matters personally, he said, because it was easier. Her social circle became curated. Invitations were filtered. Some people stopped reaching out altogether, not out of conflict, but because the pathways to her became less accessible. Even her public appearances were managed. Outfits approved, statements reviewed. Timing adjusted. From the outside, it looked like refinement. From within it was reduction. Tracy noticed every shift, not immediately in resistance, but in recognition. She understood that control did not arrive as a demand. It arrived as convenience repeated often enough to become expectation. So, she adapted. Not by confronting it, but by recording it. She kept mental notes of conversations, what was said, what was avoided, what was repeated. She paid attention to patterns in Sebastian's behavior, especially when it came to business. He spoke freely in certain moments, particularly when he believed he was speaking to someone who did not fully understand the implications. He underestimated her. That too, she recorded. When she became pregnant, the shift in Sebastian was subtle, but unmistakable. It was not the announcement that changed him. He handled that publicly with the appropriate enthusiasm. There were statements carefully worded about legacy and family. There were photographs staged but convincing that suggested anticipation. Privately, his reaction was different. Pregnancy to him was an interruption. It altered her schedule. It limited her availability. It introduced variables he could not entirely manage. He did not say these things directly, but Tracy recognized them in the adjustments he made. Fewer invitations extended to her. More events attended alone. More decisions made without consultation. There were also moments small controlled, but revealing when his patience shortened. A question asked twice. A request that complicated his plans. A delay that affected his timeline. Each time the response was measured, but edged. Tracy did not respond to those edges. She absorbed them. By the time the gala was announced, a high-profile charity event tied to several of Sebastian's business partners, the structure of their relationship had already settled into something unspoken but firm. He expected her to attend. Not as a partner, but as part of the image. The instruction came casually delivered over breakfast as he reviewed his schedule. He did not ask if she felt well enough. He did not inquire about her preferences. He simply stated the time, the location, and the expectation. Tracy nodded. Not because she agreed, but because she understood. That night would not be about presence. It would be about observation. In the days leading up to the gala, there were additional details that caught her attention. Sebastian spent more time on his phone than usual, often stepping away to take calls he did not explain. His calendar included meetings that were labeled vaguely with initials instead of names. There were emails that arrived late at night, which he read quickly and then deleted. And there was one name that appeared more frequently than the others: Clara Whitmore. She had been introduced publicly as a communications consultant. Someone brought in to refine messaging, manage perception, and expand reach. She was well-connected, well-spoken, and familiar with the kind of environment Sebastian operated in, but her presence extended beyond professional necessity. She attended meetings that did not require her expertise. She appeared at dinners that were not listed as work-related. She remained in conversations longer than others, even when those conversations shifted away from business. Tracy noticed the way Sebastian's posture changed around her. Slightly more relaxed, slightly less guarded. It was not overt, but it was consistent. One evening, when Sebastian had left his phone unattended on the kitchen counter, a message appeared on the screen. Tracy did not reach for it immediately. She waited. Another message followed. Then a third. The name confirmed what she had already understood. Clara. The content was brief but unnecessary for interpretation. Timing, location, and a tone that did not belong to professional exchange. Tracy did not open the messages. She did not need to. Instead, she noted the time they were sent, the intervals between them, the context of the day's schedule. She placed the phone exactly where it had been. And she continued. In the days that followed, She paid closer attention not to confront, but to connect. Financial documents passed through Sebastian's office more frequently. There were references to accounts she had not seen before. Transactions discussed in fragments, always incomplete, always redirected when questions approached clarity. Clara's name appeared there as well, not directly but through entities associated with her. Consulting firms, investment vehicles, partnerships that seemed temporary but recurring. Tracy began to understand that the relationship between Sebastian and Clara was not limited to personal interest. It intersected with his finances. That intersection she knew would matter. So she prepared, not for confrontation, but for confirmation. By the time the night of the gala arrived, Tracy was not attending as a wife. She was attending as a witness. And in a room designed to display power, she already knew that the most important things would not be said aloud. They would be revealed in fragments, in glances, in timing, in silence. And she intended to remember all of it. The days leading up to the gala unfolded with a kind of deliberate precision that Tracy Bryant had come to recognize as manufactured calm. Everything appeared orderly on the surface. Schedules were confirmed. Outfits were selected. Staff moved through the penthouse with quiet efficiency, preparing for an evening that had already been framed publicly and privately as significant. But beneath that order, Tracy noticed acceleration. Sebastian Hale was not a man who rushed without reason. His movements were usually measured, calculated down to the smallest margin. Yet now there were moments where he moved too quickly between decisions, where instructions were given with less explanation than usual, where attention shifted before details were resolved. To most people, it would have gone unnoticed. To Tracy, it signaled pressure. She observed it in the way he checked his phone more frequently, not out of habit, but expectation. Messages were no longer interruptions. They were anticipated. He kept the device closer than before, turning the screen away when it lit, stepping into adjacent rooms to respond. He did not explain. He did not need to. Tracy had already begun connecting the patterns. Clara Whitmore's presence expanded quietly but consistently in those same days. Her name appeared on Sebastian's calendar under various designations, consultation, review, coordination, but the timing of those entries often overlapped with events that did not require communication strategy. Once late in the afternoon, Tracy passed by Sebastian's study and noticed the door partially open. Voices carried through, not raised, but close. Clara's voice was calm, confident, familiar. Sebastian's response was softer than usual, lacking the edge he used with most people. There was a pause between sentences that suggested comfort, not calculation. Tracy did not stop. She did not need to hear more. What mattered was not the content of the conversation, but its tone and its privacy. That evening, when Sebastian joined her for dinner, he spoke about the gala as if it were a routine obligation. "The usual people will be there," he said, glancing at his tablet between sentences. "Investors, partners, a few press outlets. It's important we maintain consistency." Consistency. It was a word he used often when he meant control. "You'll be with me for the opening," he continued. "After that, just stay visible." Visible. Not engaged, not involved, simply present. Tracy nodded. She did not ask questions. Instead, she studied the details he did not mention. He did not refer to Clara, though Tracy already knew she would be there. He did not discuss the specific nature of the event beyond its public purpose. He did not outline any conversations he intended to have. That omission, too, was information. Later that night, when Sebastian stepped into the shower, his phone remained on the dresser. The screen lit up once, then again. Tracy sat at the edge of the bed. Her posture unchanged, her gaze steady. She did not reach for the device immediately. She allowed the notifications to settle the light, to fade the silence, to return. Only then did she stand. She approached the dresser without urgency, her movements controlled, deliberate. When she picked up the phone, she did not unlock it. She only observed. The preview text was enough. Clara's name, a time, a location, same arrangement, no changes. Tracy replaced the phone exactly as she had found it. She did not react outwardly. There was no shift in her expression, no tightening of her posture. But internally, the pattern sharpened. Arrangement. It was not a word used for casual meetings. It implied structure, repetition, expectation, financial or otherwise. The next morning, Tracy made a small adjustment to her routine. She requested access to the shared calendar under the pretense of coordinating her schedule with Sebastian's. It was a reasonable request, one that could not easily be denied without explanation. Sebastian granted it without hesitation. He believed transparency in limited areas created the appearance of openness. What he did not consider was how much could be inferred from what was labeled and what was not. Tracy reviewed the entries carefully. Meetings with investors were clearly marked, often with detailed notes attached. Public appearances were outlined precisely with timing down to the minute. But the entries associated with Clara were different. They were shorter, vague, sometimes reduced to initials. CW. Other times they appeared as placeholders, blocks of time without description. Yet those blocks aligned with known gaps in Sebastian's schedule. They coincided with the times he was unreachable, the moments when his attention shifted without explanation. Tracy began mapping those entries against other data. Bank notifications she had glimpsed in passing. Transfers mentioned briefly in conversations. References to accounts that were never fully explained. She did not have direct access to those accounts, but she had enough fragments to begin constructing a framework. Clara was not only present in Sebastian's personal time, she was connected to his financial movements. That afternoon, Tracy received a message from an unfamiliar number. There was no introduction, no greeting, only a line of text, confirming receipt of documents, additional details forthcoming. She read it once. Then again. The number was not saved in her contacts, but she recognized the phrasing. It was formal, structured, deliberate, legal. She did not respond immediately. Instead, she saved the message under a neutral label and continued with her day as if nothing had changed. Because outwardly, nothing had. The penthouse remained quiet. Staff moved in and out with practiced discretion. Sebastian conducted calls in his study, his tone returning to its usual sharpness when speaking to colleagues. Only occasionally did that tone soften. And when it did, Tracy knew who was on the other end. By the evening before the gala, the pieces had begun to settle into place. Not completely, but enough. Tracy stood in front of the mirror as a stylist adjusted the final details of her dress. The fabric was understated elegant without drawing attention. It followed the lines of her body without emphasizing them, a deliberate choice that aligned with Sebastian's preference for a controlled presentation. Her reflection remained calm, unchanged. To anyone else, she would appear as she always did, composed, reserved, present. But behind that stillness, her awareness had deepened. She was no longer observing isolated behaviors. She was tracking a system, a network of actions, decisions, and omissions that extended beyond personal betrayal into something more structured, something that could be documented. As the stylist stepped back satisfied, Tracy placed her hand lightly over her abdomen. The gesture was subtle, instinctive, protective, not only of the life she carried, but of the position she now occupied. Sebastian entered the room a moment later, adjusting the cuff of his suit. His gaze moved over her briefly, assessing rather than appreciating. "You're ready," he said. It was not a question. Tracy met his gaze in the mirror, her expression unchanged. Yes. He nodded once, already turning toward the door. There was no further conversation, no acknowledgement of what the evening represented beyond its surface. To Sebastian, the gala was an event to manage. To Tracy, it was a point of convergence. As they stepped into the elevator, the city stretched out below them, lights reflecting against glass and steel. The movement downward was smooth, controlled, uninterrupted. Sebastian checked his phone once more, his attention divided even in transition. Tracy stood beside him, silent, observing. By the time the doors opened to the waiting car, the roles were already defined. He would perform, she would witness. And somewhere within that performance, the truth would reveal itself, not through confrontation, but through accumulation. Because Tracy Bryant understood something Sebastian Hale did not. Power did not always belong to the one who spoke the loudest. Sometimes it belonged to the one who remembered everything. The ballroom of the Langford Grand opened like a carefully staged illusion, light, sound, and motion arranged to suggest ease where there was none. Crystal chandeliers cast a white brilliance across polished marble floors. Servers moved in quiet patterns, their paths rehearsed. Conversations rose and fell in measured tones, each exchange calibrated for visibility. Cameras lingered at the edges, capturing angles that would later be edited into narratives of generosity and influence. It was a room designed to reflect power. Sebastian Hale entered as if it belonged to him. There was no announcement, but attention shifted regardless. People adjusted their posture, their expressions, their proximity. Some moved closer. Others maintained distance, calculating the value of timing. Sebastian acknowledged them with practiced efficiency handshakes that lasted exactly long enough eye contact that suggested recognition without commitment. Tracy Bryant walked beside him, not behind, not ahead, exactly where she was expected to be. Her presence completed the image, but did not interrupt it. She felt the room register her in fragments. A glance here, a pause there. Recognition without engagement. To many, she remained an accessory to Sebastian's narrative, elegant, composed, and undefined. That suited her. She did not need their attention. She needed their patterns. As they moved deeper into the ballroom, Tracy allowed her gaze to settle on the details others overlooked. The arrangement of seating, the clusters of conversation, the individuals who held space without speaking, and those who filled silence too quickly. She noted who approached Sebastian immediately, and who waited. She noted who addressed her directly and who did not. She noted the ones who looked at her with curiosity and the ones who avoided her gaze altogether. Each reaction carried weight. Sebastian guided her toward a central table reserved for key attendees. The placement ensured visibility from multiple angles, strategic, deliberate. "Stay close for the opening," he said quietly, his tone controlled but distant. "After that, just circulate. Circulate. Again, not engage." Tracy inclined her head slightly. "I understand." He did not respond. His attention had already shifted to an approaching group, 2 investors, and a political figure, whose presence required immediate acknowledgement. Tracy stepped back just enough to create space, and then she watched. Clara Whitmore entered the room several minutes later. There was no formal introduction, no announcement of arrival. Yet her presence moved through the space with a different kind of recognition. Heads turned not sharply, but in acknowledgement of someone already known. She wore confidence as easily as the tailored dress that followed her movements without restraint. Her posture suggested familiarity with the environment, not deference to it. More importantly, she did not hesitate. She approached Sebastian directly. There was a moment, brief, almost imperceptible, when their proximity changed the rhythm of the room. Conversations nearby, adjusted attention recalibrated. Not because anything explicit occurred, but because something implicit was confirmed. Clara did not greet Tracy immediately. Instead, she addressed Sebastian first. Everything on schedule, she asked, her voice low, controlled. Sebastian's response was equally measured. As expected, their exchange was brief, but the tone carried a familiarity that extended beyond professional alignment. Only then did Clara turn to Tracy. Her smile was precise, polite, calculated. "Tracy," she said, inclining her head slightly. "You look well." It was not a compliment. It was an assessment. Tracy met her gaze without change. "Thank you." There was no further exchange. Clara's attention returned to Sebastian, her body angling toward him in a way that suggested continuity rather than introduction. They moved together subtly but consistently. Not enough to draw overt scrutiny, enough to establish a pattern. Tracy did not follow. She allowed the space between them to widen, not as retreat, but as repositioning. From a distance, she could see more. The event progressed with the expected sequence: opening remarks, acknowledgments, the structured flow of speeches that framed the evening's purpose. Applause rose at appropriate intervals. Laughter followed cues. Cameras captured expressions that would later be interpreted as sincerity. Sebastian took his place among the speakers with practiced confidence. His voice carried easily across the room, each sentence constructed to reinforce his position not only within his company, but within the broader network of influence that surrounded him. Tracy watched from the edge of the audience. Not hidden, not central. Exactly where she could observe without interruption. From that position, she saw what others missed: the way Clara positioned herself just within Sebastian's line of sight during his speech. The brief moments when his gaze shifted toward her, not enough to be noticed by the crowd, but consistent enough to be intentional. She saw the individuals who exchanged glances when those moments occurred. She saw the ones who pretended not to. She saw the subtle recalibration of alliances happening in real time. After the speeches concluded, the room loosened. Conversations expanded. Movement increased. The rigid structure of the formal program gave way to the fluid negotiations that defined gatherings like this. Sebastian stepped down from the stage and was immediately surrounded. Investors, partners, media representatives. Clara joined that circle without hesitation. Her presence there was not questioned. Tracy remained where she was, not excluded, not invited, unnecessary to the exchange. She turned her attention elsewhere. Near the far side of the ballroom, partially obscured by a column, stood a man who did not participate in the visible dynamics of the room: Richard Bryant. He was not introduced. His name was not announced. To most attendees, he was simply another guest, older, composed, unremarkable, in a setting defined by spectacle. But Tracy saw him, not because he signaled her, because he did not. He stood with the stillness of someone who did not need to move to be present. His gaze moved across the room with quiet precision, pausing only when necessary, never lingering long enough to draw attention. When his eyes met Tracy's, there was no acknowledgement, no gesture, only recognition. And then, as if nothing had passed between them, his gaze shifted away. Tracy did the same. Their connection did not require display. It existed beneath it. She returned her attention to the room, to Sebastian, to Clara, to the network of interactions that continued to unfold. Time passed without clear markers. Minutes blended into conversations, conversations into observations. At one point, a reporter approached Tracy with a question about the evening, her tone carefully neutral. "How does it feel to be part of such an important event?" Tracy's response was measured. "It's a well-organized gathering. Nothing more, no elaboration." The reporter nodded, satisfied with the absence of controversy, and moved on. Tracy remained, still, present, watching. As the evening progressed, the distance between Sebastian and Clara became less subtle. Not overt, never explicit, but consistent. They stood closer than necessary, spoke in tones that excluded others, shared moments that suggested alignment beyond the scope of professional collaboration. People noticed. They did not comment, because in rooms like this, awareness did not always lead to action. Sometimes it led to silence. And silence, Tracy understood, was often the most revealing response. By the time the final portion of the evening approached the unstructured hours where formalities dissolved entirely, the patterns had solidified. Sebastian moved through the room with increasing confidence, buoyed by attention reinforced by proximity to Clara. He believed the narrative was intact, controlled, unchallenged. Tracy stood near the edge of the ballroom once more, her hand resting lightly against her side, her posture unchanged. To anyone observing, she remained what she had always been in this space: quiet, composed, peripheral. But within that stillness, she held something the room did not yet understand. Continuity, every glance, every omission, every alignment. Recorded, not written, remembered. Because Tracy Bryant did not need to interrupt the performance. She only needed to let it complete itself. And when it did, the truth would not need to be argued. It would already be visible. By the time the evening reached its final stretch, the atmosphere in the ballroom had shifted from structured elegance to something less controlled. The music softened into a background rhythm. Conversations grew louder, less measured. The careful choreography of earlier hours dissolved into clusters of influence negotiation and quiet alignment. Glasses were refilled more frequently. Laughter lingered longer than necessary. Sebastian Hale moved through it all with increasing certainty. He believed the night had gone as intended. His speech had been well received. Key investors had reaffirmed their positions. The press had captured images that would circulate favorably by morning. Even the subtle presence of Clara Whitmore at his side, no longer entirely subtle, had not disrupted the narrative he had constructed. If anything, it reinforced his confidence. Control to Sebastian was not just about outcomes. It was about perception. And perception, he believed, remained firmly in his grasp. Tracy Bryant stood near one of the side tables, her position unchanged for several minutes at a time. She had become part of the room's background, acknowledged, but no longer actively engaged. It allowed her to see more. From that vantage point, she observed the way conversations shifted when Sebastian approached. The slight recalibration of tone, the adjustment of posture, the careful selection of words. She saw how quickly people aligned themselves with his energy, how readily they mirrored his confidence. She also saw the fractures, the glances exchanged between those who had noticed Clara's proximity, the brief hesitations before certain responses, the subtle distancing of individuals who preferred not to be directly associated with ambiguity. No one spoke of it. But it was there. Clara stood with Sebastian now, closer than she had been earlier in the evening. Their conversation with a group of investors appeared fluid, almost rehearsed. She contributed at the right moments, her voice blending seamlessly into the exchange. To an outside observer, it could have been interpreted as collaboration. To Tracy, it was confirmation. The pattern had reached a point where it no longer required concealment. It simply required acceptance. A server passed by Tracy, offering a tray of drinks. She declined with a slight shake of her head, her focus remaining on the center of the room. Her hand rested lightly over her abdomen, not as a display, but as a quiet point of grounding. Across the ballroom, Sebastian's attention shifted. It was not immediate. It did not happen with intention at first, but gradually as conversations concluded and new ones formed, his gaze moved through the room until it found Tracy. For a moment he studied her. Not with concern, with irritation. It was subtle but present. She had not followed the script he had set. She had not circulated as expected. She had not engaged in the visible exchanges that reinforced the image he preferred. Instead, she had remained still, observable, unpredictable. That stillness in a room built on performance disrupted more than movement would have. Sebastian excused himself from the group with a brief remark and began to cross the floor. Clara watched him go. She did not follow. She did not need to. Tracy saw him approaching long before he reached her. She did not shift her position. She did not prepare a response. She simply remained. When he stopped in front of her, the space between them carried a different weight than it had earlier in the evening. Not public, not private, something in between. "You've been standing here all night," Sebastian said, his voice low but edged. "I told you to circulate." Tracy lifted her gaze to meet his. "I've been observing," she replied. The answer was not confrontational, but it was not compliant. Sebastian's expression tightened slightly. "This isn't a place for observation," he said. "It's a place for presence. I am present." The exchange drew no immediate attention. Conversations around them continued, though a few nearby figures registered the shift in tone. Sebastian leaned in slightly, reducing the space between them. "You're making this look wrong," he said quietly. "People notice when you don't participate." Tracy held his gaze. "People notice many things," she said. It was a simple statement, but it carried implication. For a brief moment, Sebastian's composure faltered, not visibly to the room, but enough for Tracy to register. "You don't understand how this works," he said, his voice tightening further. "Everything here depends on alignment." Alignment with what Tracy asked. The question was soft, direct. Sebastian straightened, his patience thinning. "With me," he said. There was no ambiguity in the answer. Around them, the room continued its rhythm, unaware of the precise point where attention began to concentrate. Tracy did not respond immediately. She allowed the silence to settle. Not as resistance, as space. Sebastian interpreted it differently, as defiance. His gaze shifted briefly, scanning the surrounding area. A few individuals had begun to glance in their direction, not directly, but with peripheral awareness. Enough to register, not enough to intervene. He stepped closer. "You're not in a position to question me here," he said, his voice now carrying a sharper edge. "Not tonight." Tracy's expression remained unchanged. "I didn't realize there was a schedule for that," she replied. The words were measured, but they disrupted the balance he expected. Something in Sebastian's posture shifted, subtle but decisive. Control, once challenged, demanded reassertion. He reached out, not to strike immediately, but to emphasize the proximity of his authority. His hand moved toward her arm, gripping just firmly enough to establish contact. Tracy did not pull away. She did not react. The stillness continued, and in that stillness, something in Sebastian escalated. The restraint that had defined his public behavior throughout the evening fractured in a single, uncalculated moment. His hand moved. The sound was sharp, not loud, but precise enough to cut through the surrounding noise. For a fraction of a second, the room paused. Conversations stalled mid-sentence. Glasses hovered before lips. Eyes shifted, not directly, but collectively. No one spoke. No one moved forward. The space around them widened without anyone stepping back. Tracy's head turned slightly, with the impact at her body absorbing the motion without losing balance. Her hand remained where it had been, resting lightly over her abdomen. She did not raise her voice. She did not raise her hand. She did not respond. Instead, she returned her gaze to him. Calm, unbroken. And in that gaze, there was no fear, only recognition. Sebastian held his position for a moment longer than necessary, as if waiting for a reaction that would justify the action. It did not come. Around them the silence deepened. Not empty, full of awareness, full of decision. Because every person in that room now faced the same choice: to act or to remain still. They remained still. One by one, conversations resumed quieter, more cautious but present. The rhythm of the evening attempted to reassemble itself around the fracture, but it did not fully recover. Because something had shifted, not in the structure of the event, in the perception of it. Tracy lowered her gaze briefly, not in submission, but in completion. Then she took a single step back. Not hurried, not hesitant, deliberate. Sebastian did not follow. For the first time that evening, he hesitated. Not because he lacked authority, but because he had exposed something that could not be fully controlled. Across the room, Richard Bryant remained where he had been, watching, not intervening. Because what had just happened did not require interruption. It required consequence. And consequence, he understood, did not always arrive immediately. Sometimes it began in silence. Tracy turned and walked away from the center of the room. Not toward an exit, not toward anyone else. Simply away. Behind her, the gala continued. But no longer as it had before, because the performance had been broken. And once broken, it could not be restored to its original form. Sebastian remained where he stood, the weight of the moment settling around him in ways he did not yet fully understand. He believed the damage could be managed, contained, adjusted. He believed the narrative could still be controlled. What he did not yet see was that the most important part of the evening had already been recorded, not by cameras, not by the press, but by the one person who had never needed to speak to hold the truth. And she had not missed a single detail. The car ride back from the gala unfolded without conversation. City lights moved across the tinted windows in long, uninterrupted streaks, reflecting a version of the night that looked calm from a distance. Inside, the silence held a different texture, dense, deliberate, unbroken. Sebastian Hale sat across from Tracy Bryant, his posture composed, his gaze directed toward the faint glow of his phone. He had already begun the process of containment. Messages were being sent. Calls were being scheduled. Statements were being shaped before the event could settle into public memory. He did not look at her. Not immediately. To him, the moment at the gala had already shifted categories from action to incident, from incident to problem, from problem to solution. His mind moved through those stages with practiced efficiency. Tracy, on the other hand, did not categorize. She recalled. Every second of the moment replayed, not as emotion, but as sequence. The distance between them, the words exchanged, the precise timing of the impact, the way the room responded, not with outrage, but with restraint. More importantly, she remembered who saw it, who paused, who resumed. She cataloged those reactions with the same quiet discipline she had applied to everything else. Her hand rested over her abdomen, steady, not protective in the dramatic sense, grounded. By the time the car reached the penthouse building, Sebastian had already transitioned fully into strategy. As the door opened and the driver stepped back, he exited first, his expression neutral, his movements controlled. Tracy followed without hesitation. Inside, the lobby was quiet, late enough to avoid attention, early enough that the night had not fully ended. They entered the private elevator. The doors closed with a soft, final sound that sealed the silence in place. Sebastian spoke then. "We'll handle this before morning." His voice was even measured, as if outlining a routine adjustment. Tracy did not respond. He continued. "There were enough people there who understand discretion. The press will run what they're given. We'll make sure they're given the right version. Version, not truth. The elevator rose. Tracy watched the numbers change. She did not ask what that version would be. She did not need to. Sebastian glanced at her reflection in the mirrored panel. "You shouldn't have engaged me like that," he said. "Not there." The statement was not an apology. It was a recalibration of blame. Tracy turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze through the reflection. "I asked a question." "You challenged me," he replied. There was a distinction in his mind. A hierarchy. Questions in his structure were acceptable only within certain boundaries. Outside those boundaries, they became threats. "You made it visible," he added. The elevator slowed as it approached the top floor. Tracy considered the words. Visible. He was not referring to the act itself. He was referring to its exposure. "I didn't make anything visible," she said quietly. It already was. The doors opened. Sebastian stepped out first, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. He did not respond. Inside the penthouse, the environment remained unchanged. Soft lighting, clean lines. The controlled stillness of a space designed for presentation rather than comfort. Staff had already retired for the night. No witnesses, no audience. Only the aftermath. Sebastian moved directly to his study, loosening his tie as he went. His phone remained in his hand, his attention fixed on the next steps. Tracy heard the door close behind him, the faint click of separation marking the end of the shared space. She did not follow. Instead, she walked slowly toward the living area, her movements unhurried. She paused briefly at the window, looking out over the city. From that height, everything appeared distant, contained, ordered. But she understood that distance did not change structure. It only changed perspective. After a moment, she turned away and walked toward the bedroom. Inside, the space reflected the same controlled design as the rest of the penthouse. Nothing out of place, nothing excessive. Every object positioned with intention. She removed her earrings first, placing them carefully on the dresser. Then the bracelet, then the dress. Each movement deliberate, not mechanical, measured. In the quiet, her phone vibrated once against the surface. She did not reach for it immediately. She finished what she was doing. Then she stepped closer. The screen displayed a single message. From Henderson & Cole, LLP. No subject line, no greeting. Only content. Initial review confirms irregular transfers linked to Hale Capital accounts. Additional documentation secured. Recommend immediate consultation. Tracy read it once, then again. There was no urgency in her reaction, only confirmation. What she had observed, what she had inferred, now supported. She set the phone down, not dismissively, deliberately, because the message did not change her course. It clarified it. In the study, Sebastian's voice carried faintly through the closed door. Controlled, authoritative shifting between tones depending on the person on the other end of the call. At one point, his voice lowered further. "Handle the footage," he said. A pause. "No, not everything. Just what's necessary." Another pause. "Make sure it aligns." Align. Always alignment. Tracy listened for a moment, not to gather new information, but to confirm consistency. Then she turned away. She moved to the small desk near the window, where a leather-bound notebook rested unused by appearance, but positioned within reach. She did not open it. She did not write. Everything she needed was already recorded. Not in ink, in sequence, in structure. She sat down, her posture upright, her hands resting lightly on the surface. For a long moment she did nothing. Not inaction, stillness, because action she understood required precision, and precision required timing. Her phone vibrated again. A second message, different number, unknown. She picked it up this time. The message was brief. Camera coverage confirmed. Multiple angles. Timestamp secured. No signature. No explanation. None needed. Tracy's gaze remained on the screen for a moment longer than before. Then she set the phone down again. This time closer. Accessible. Because now the fragments had begun to connect. Public event. Private action. Recorded. Documented. Corroborated. Across the apartment, Sebastian ended his call. The study door opened. His footsteps approached measured, controlled. He stopped at the threshold of the living area, his gaze settling on Tracy. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he said, "This will be handled." The certainty in his voice had returned, not because the situation was resolved, because he believed it could be. Tracy looked at him, her expression unchanged. "I know," she said. He interpreted the response as agreement, as acceptance. He nodded once satisfied, then turned away, returning to his study. The door closed again. Tracy remained where she was, still, composed, watching nothing, thinking everything. Because for the first time since the gala began, the imbalance had shifted, not outwardly, not visibly, but structurally. Sebastian was managing perception. She was assembling truth. And those two processes did not move at the same speed. One required immediate control. The other required complete accuracy. Tracy chose accuracy because she understood something he did not. Control could suppress a moment, but it could not erase a record. And now there was a record, not just of what had happened, but of how it had been allowed to happen, and who had chosen to remain silent. That more than anything would matter. Morning arrived without ceremony. The city resumed its rhythm as if nothing had fractured the night before. News cycles turned. Markets opened. Traffic filled the streets beneath the glass towers that reflected a version of normalcy no one questioned closely enough. Inside the penthouse, the air held the same controlled stillness. Sebastian Hale was already awake, already in motion. By the time Tracy Bryant stepped into the living area, he was seated at the long dining table. A tablet propped before him, a cup of coffee untouched at his side. His attention moved between screens messages and incoming calls with practiced efficiency. He had not mentioned the gala again. Not directly. But his actions spoke in its place. Public relations teams had been activated. Legal advisors had been consulted not for defense, but for containment. Statements were being drafted, reviewed, adjusted. There would be no denial, only reinterpretation. An isolated incident, a misunderstanding, a moment taken out of context. The language would be careful. It always was. Tracy observed him from across the room. Her posture composed her presence unannounced. He did not look up immediately. When he did, it was brief. "You should stay in today," he said. "Let things settle." It was not a suggestion. It was a directive. Tracy nodded once. Of course. There was no resistance in her tone. No agreement either. Sebastian returned his attention to the screen, satisfied with the absence of conflict. He did not ask where she intended to go. He did not consider that she might not remain. Because in his structure, movement required permission, and Tracy had never requested it. She moved quietly through the apartment, gathering what she needed without disruption. A simple coat, her phone, a small leather folder that appeared empty to anyone who did not know what it represented. By the time Sebastian rose from the table to take a call in his study, she was already at the door. He did not hear her leave. The elevator carried her down in silence. Outside, the city felt different in the morning light, less curated, more exposed. Details that had been softened by evening now appeared with clarity. Faces, buildings movement. everything visible. Tracy stepped onto the sidewalk and paused only long enough to orient herself. Then she moved. The office of Henderson and Cole LLP occupied the upper floors of a building that did not advertise its significance. There were no large signs, no public displays of prestige. Only a quiet reception area, a controlled environment, and a staff trained to recognize importance without announcement. When Tracy entered, the receptionist looked up with immediate recognition, not of her name, but of the instruction that had preceded her arrival. "Miss Bryant," she said, standing. "Mr. Cole is expecting you." No questions, no delays. Tracy followed her down a corridor lined with closed doors, each one concealing conversations that did not belong outside those walls. At the end of the hall, the receptionist paused and knocked once before opening the door. "Mr. Cole." Daniel Cole stood from behind his desk as Tracy entered. He was in his early 50s, his expression composed in a way that suggested long familiarity with situations that required discretion. His suit was understated, his posture precise. "Miss Bryant," he said, "thank you for coming." Tracy inclined her head slightly. "Thank you for receiving me." The receptionist closed the door behind her, leaving the room sealed. For a moment, neither spoke. Daniel gestured toward the chair opposite his desk. "Please." Tracy sat placing her folder on the surface in front of her. She did not open it. Daniel returned to his seat, his hands resting lightly on the desk. "I'll be direct," he said. "What we've reviewed so far confirms a pattern." He did not elaborate immediately. He did not need to. Tracy met his gaze. "What kind of pattern?" she asked. Daniel reached for a document at his side, sliding it forward just enough for her to see the headings. "Financial transfers routed through secondary entities," he said. "Accounts that are not publicly associated with Hale Capital, but are linked through layered ownership structures." Tracy's expression did not change. "Clara Whitmore?" she asked. Daniel nodded once. "Indirectly," he said. "Her name doesn't appear as a primary holder, but the entities trace back to firms she's connected to." He paused, allowing the information to settle. "There's more," he added. He turned another page, revealing a sequence of transactions marked by dates and amounts. "These transfers align with specific events," he said. "Meetings travel private engagements. The timing suggests coordination. Coordination, not coincidence." Tracy absorbed the information without interruption. "Is it illegal?" she asked. Daniel's response was measured. "Some of it," he said. "At minimum, it raises serious compliance issues. At worst, it could support charges related to financial misconduct." He closed the folder. "That depends on how far we take it." Silence followed. Not empty, evaluative. Tracy's gaze moved briefly to the documents, then back to Daniel. "And the incident last night?" she asked. Daniel did not hesitate. "We have confirmation of video," he said. "Multiple angles. The footage hasn't been widely distributed yet, but it exists." Tracy's hand rested lightly against the edge of the desk. "Can it be secured? It already has been," Daniel replied. "Copies are stored, access is controlled." He leaned back slightly, studying her. "The question isn't whether we have enough," he said. "The question is what you intend to do with it." Tracy did not answer immediately. She considered the structure of what lay before her, not as separate issues, but as a system. Financial misconduct, personal behavior, public exposure. Each element reinforced the others. Each one alone might be managed. Together they formed something more difficult to contain. "I want everything documented," she said finally. Daniel nodded. "That's already in progress. I want it structured," she continued. "Clear, complete, no assumptions." "Understood. And I don't want anything released prematurely." Daniel paused, then inclined his head slightly. "You're not looking for immediate leverage," he said. "No," Tracy replied. She held his gaze. "I'm looking for accuracy." There was no emphasis in her tone, no urgency, but the clarity of intention was unmistakable. Daniel closed the folder, completely placing his hand over it. "In that case," he said, "we proceed carefully." He reached for a separate document. "There's also the matter of your personal position," he added. "Your legal protection, your assets, I'm aware," Tracy said. She did not interrupt sharply. "Only precisely." Daniel stopped. For a moment, he studied her again. Not as a client, as a calculation. "You've already considered this," he said. "Yes." "And you've already decided?" "Yes." He nodded once. "Then we'll build accordingly." The meeting continued for another hour, moving through details that did not require repetition. Structures were outlined. Steps were defined. Timelines were suggested, but not fixed. When it ended, Tracy stood gathering her folder without opening it. Daniel remained seated. "If you need to accelerate this," he said, "we can." Tracy paused at the door. "I won't," she replied. She turned slightly. "Not yet." Daniel did not question the decision. He simply nodded. As Tracy stepped back into the corridor, the door closed behind her with the same quiet finality as before. Outside, the city continued, unaware, unchanged. But beneath that surface, something had begun to take shape. Not loudly, not visibly, but with structure. And structure, once established, did not collapse easily. Tracy stepped into the elevator, her reflection steady in the mirrored walls. She did not check her phone. She did not review the documents. She did not need to, because the process had already begun. And unlike the performance of the night before, this process did not depend on perception. It depended on proof. By the third morning after the gala, the narrative had begun to take shape. Not the truth, the version. Headlines appeared with careful restraint. Language softened the edges, diluted the impact, repositioned the moment into something less precise. A tense exchange at a private event. A misunderstanding between high-profile figures. A personal moment taken out of context. No mention of the sound. No description of the silence that followed. No acknowledgement of the room that had chosen not to move. Sebastian Hale's influence moved quietly through the cycle, not by force, but by familiarity. Editors who owed him access framed their words carefully. Commentators who relied on his proximity chose neutrality over scrutiny. The footage did not surface. Not yet. Inside the penthouse, the television played softly in the background, cycling through segments that referenced the gala without ever fully addressing it. The volume remained low, as if even sound required moderation. Sebastian stood near the window, phone pressed to his ear, his posture rigid in a way that suggested control, being maintained rather than assumed. "We're not denying anything," he said. "We're contextualizing it." A pause. "No, there's no need to escalate. Keep it contained." Another pause. "I said contained." His tone sharpened slightly, then softened again as the call shifted. Across the room, Tracy Bryant sat at the long table. Her posture unchanged, her attention divided between the muted television and the documents laid neatly before her. She had not responded publicly. She had not issued a statement. She had not corrected the narrative. Instead, she watched it unfold. Every word chosen, every omission intentional. She noted which outlets aligned closely with Sebastian's framing and which maintained distance. She observed the subtle variations in tone, how some articles leaned toward neutrality while others implied fault without naming it. None of them addressed the core. That she understood was by design. Her phone rested beside her, silent for the moment. The messages from Henderson and Cole LLP had slowed not because progress had stopped, but because it had moved into a phase that required less communication and more execution. Documentation was being structured. Evidence was being organized. Nothing was being released. Not yet. Sebastian ended his call and turned toward her, his expression composed. "It's stabilizing," he said. He did not specify what. He did not need to. Tracy looked up from the table. For now, she replied. The words were simple, neutral, but they introduced a distinction he did not acknowledge. Sebastian dismissed it with a slight movement of his hand. "It won't go further," he said. "There's nothing for it to attach to, nothing visible, nothing confirmed, nothing in his view substantial enough to disrupt the structure he had built." Tracy did not argue. She returned her gaze to the documents, because she understood that visibility was not the same as existence. And what existed beneath the surface did not require acknowledgement to remain real. Later that afternoon, Sebastian left for a series of meetings he had rescheduled in the aftermath of the gala. His schedule had tightened, his movements more deliberate. He was reinforcing connections, reasserting presence, reminding those within his network that his position remained unchanged. Clara Whitmore appeared in those movements again. Photographs surfaced online, carefully selected, intentionally framed. She stood beside him at a lunch meeting, her expression composed, her posture aligned with his, in a way that suggested continuity rather than disruption. The images circulated quietly at first, then more broadly. No commentary accompanied them. None was necessary. The implication was clear. Tracy saw them, not immediately, but eventually. She did not react. She observed. The pattern remained consistent. Personal and professional lines continued to blur in ways that could not be easily separated, which meant they could not be easily defended. That evening, Tracy received a call she had anticipated. The number was not saved, but the voice was familiar. Tracy. Richard Bryant did not introduce himself. He did not need to. "I saw the coverage," he continued. "And what's missing from it?" Tracy stood near the window as she listened, the city stretching out below her in the fading light. "It's incomplete," she said. "It's controlled," Richard replied. There was no emotion in his tone, only assessment. A pause followed. "Then, do you want me to intervene?" The question was direct, uncomplicated. Tracy did not answer immediately. She considered the weight of it not as an offer, but as a shift in structure. Intervention would change the pace, the scale, the visibility. "No," she said finally. Another pause, longer this time. "You're certain?" Richard asked. "Yes." Her voice did not waver. "I need it to be documented properly." Richard exhaled softly, not in frustration, but in acknowledgement. "You're choosing the slower path," he said. "Yes, the harder one." "Yes." Another pause. Then, "All right." There was no argument, no persuasion, only acceptance. "I'll remain available," he added, "if that changes." "It won't," Tracy replied. She ended the call without further exchange. The silence that followed was not empty. It was settled, because the decision had been made, not in reaction to the gala, not in response to Sebastian, but in alignment with something deeper. Principle, structure, control not of others, but of process. The next morning, new articles appeared. The narrative remained consistent, measured, contained. But small shifts had begun to emerge. A question raised here, a detail mentioned there, nothing definitive, but enough to suggest that the story was not entirely stable, that something beneath it resisted simplification. Tracy sat at the table once more, her phone beside her, her posture unchanged. A message appeared. From Daniel Cole. Additional records confirmed. Pattern extends further than initial review. Recommend review at your convenience. She read it once, then set the phone down, not dismissively, deliberately. because the process was unfolding exactly as she intended. Slowly, completely, without interference. Across the city, Sebastian continued to manage perception. Meetings, calls, appearances, each one reinforcing the narrative he believed would hold. But he had not yet seen what Tracy had begun to assemble. He had not yet understood that control over information did not equal control over truth, and that once truth was structured fully precisely without gaps, it did not need to be forced into visibility. It revealed itself, in time. Tracy looked out over the city again, her reflection steady against the glass. She did not rush. She did not react. She waited, because she understood something the room at the gala had not. Silence was not absence. It was accumulation. And what she was building now would not rely on noise to be heard. It would rely on certainty. Richard Bryant did not belong to the circles that photographed themselves. His name did not appear in the same publications as Sebastian Hale's. He did not sit on visible boards, did not attend panels, did not offer commentary. If he entered a room, it was rarely announced. If he influenced an outcome, it was never attributed. That absence was not accidental. It was structural. The first time Tracy understood the extent of her father's reach, she was 12 years old, standing in a quiet hallway outside a closed door. Voices moved inside, low-controlled, unfamiliar. She did not listen long. She did not need to. She learned early that proximity to power did not require visibility. It required discretion. Richard had raised her with that principle at the center of everything. There were no direct lessons, no formal instructions. Only patterns. Only boundaries. What was said. What was not. What was allowed to be seen. What remained behind it. He did not speak to her about the nature of his work in explicit terms. But he did not hide its existence either. He framed it simply. There are systems, he had told her once. Some are written. Some are understood. Most people only see one. Tracy had asked which one mattered more. The one that holds when the other fails, he said. She did not ask again. Years later, sitting in her own apartment across from Daniel Cole's carefully organized documents, she understood what he had meant. The system Sebastian operated in was visible. Markets, investments, public perception, legal frameworks that could be navigated, adjusted, sometimes avoided. The system her father understood existed beneath that. Not outside the law, but adjacent to its limitations. Capable of influencing outcomes without appearing to. Capable of applying pressure without being traced. Richard Bryant was not a criminal in the conventional sense. His operations, as they were understood by those who understood them, existed within the margins of legality, complex financial networks, strategic holdings relationships that extended beyond formal contracts. To some, he was an investor. To others, a negotiator. To a few, something more difficult to define. A kingpin, if the word were to be used at all, not because of overt control, but because of reach. Tracy had been kept separate from that world. Intentionally. Richard ensured her education followed a different path, structured, formal, rooted in institutions that valued clarity over ambiguity. She studied finance law systems that could be documented and defended. He never discouraged her independence. He reinforced it. If you rely on what I have, he told her once, you inherit its consequences. If you build your own, you control them. She chose to build. Which was why when she married Sebastian, Hale Richard did not intervene. He observed. He met Sebastian once briefly in a setting that did not invite scrutiny. The conversation was polite, controlled. Each man assessing the other without revealing what mattered. Sebastian saw a reserved older man with quiet confidence. Richard saw a structure, ambitious, expansive, predictable in its need for control. Afterward, he said nothing. To Tracy, he offered only one question. Do you understand the environment you're entering? Yes, she replied. He nodded. Then you don't need my approval. He never gave it. He never withheld it. He simply remained. Now, years later, that same presence lingered at the edge of her decisions, not interfering, not guiding, available. The offer he had made over the phone remained open. Intervention. A single word that carried multiple possibilities. It could mean influence applied quietly, pressure on financial institutions, disruptions in networks. Sebastian relied on conversations that altered outcomes before they became visible. It could mean exposure information released through channels that bypassed public relations, entirely reaching those who would act without delay. It could mean protection, ensuring that whatever Tracy chose to do, no counteraction could reach her. All of it efficient. All of it immediate. All of it outside the structure Tracy had chosen. She understood the advantage. She also understood the cost, because intervention of that kind did not operate on evidence. It operated on leverage, and leverage once used could not be fully withdrawn. Tracy sat at the small desk near the window, Daniel Cole's documents spread before her in ordered stacks. Each page represented a fragment of a system that had been concealed through complexity, transactions routed through multiple entities, accounts layered under secondary ownership, connections between Sebastian and Clara that extended beyond personal interaction into financial coordination was not complete. Not yet. But it was coherent, enough to form a case, enough to support action. Her phone rested beside the documents, the last message from Daniel still visible. Pattern extends further than initial review. She read it again, not for the content, for the implication. There was more, which meant there was risk, not to her. To the structure Sebastian believed was secure. Across the city, he continued to operate within that belief. Meetings scheduled, statements refined, appearances maintained. He had not reached out to Tracy since the morning after the gala beyond necessary exchanges. There were no apologies, no attempts to revisit the incident. To him, it had been resolved, contained, managed. Tracy did not correct that assumption, because his certainty worked in her favor. The less he anticipated, the more complete the structure she was building could become. Her phone vibrated once. A new message from Daniel. Additional entity identified. Direct link to Whitmore Holdings. Documentation attached. Tracy opened the file. The structure unfolded in clean lines, ownership percentages, transaction histories, dates aligned with known events. Clara Whitmore's involvement was no longer indirect. It was documented, clear, traceable. Tracy closed the file. Not because she was finished, because she had seen enough for now. She stood moving to the window once more. The city below remained constant movement, noise light, a system functioning on visible patterns. Behind her, on the desk, the documents remained still, silent. But within them, another system had begun to take shape. One that did not rely on perception, one that did not require immediate action, only completion. Her phone remained in her hand. She did not call Richard. She did not request intervention. Instead, she sent a single message to Daniel. Continue documentation, no release. The response came quickly. Understood. Tracy set the phone down. Her reflection in the glass remained steady, unchanged. Because the decision had already been made. Not in that moment, long before. She would not use her father's reach. She would not accelerate the process through means that bypassed structure. She would proceed through the system that Sebastian believed he controlled. Because that was where his vulnerability existed, not in what he could not see, in what he believed he had already secured. Tracy turned away from the window, returning to the desk. She gathered the documents, aligning them precisely. Each page placed with intention, each detail accounted for, because accuracy required discipline, and discipline required patience. She had both. And unlike the room at the gala, unlike the narratives being shaped in the days that followed, she did not need to move quickly to maintain control. She needed to move correctly, because when the time came, speed would not determine the outcome. Structure would. And the structure she was building did not depend on force. It depended on proof. The file did not grow quickly. It expanded with precision. Each addition was deliberate, verified, and placed within a structure that did not allow for assumption. Daniel Cole did not forward information as it arrived. He filtered it, confirmed it, and then integrated it into a framework that could withstand scrutiny beyond presentation. Tracy Bryant reviewed that framework in silence, not daily, not compulsively, at intervals that allowed distance between observation and evaluation, because she understood that urgency could distort clarity, and clarity, once compromised, could not be fully restored. The documents now occupied more than one folder. Financial records formed the foundation transactions, routed through layered entities accounts that appeared disconnected until mapped against each other. Dates aligned with specific movements. Transfers corresponded to meetings, travel, private engagements that had once seemed incidental. Now they were consistent, patterned, traceable. Clara Whitmore's involvement had shifted from peripheral to central. The entity identified as Whitmore Holdings was no longer an abstract reference. It was a conduit receiving redistributing linking funds that originated from sources tied to Hale Capital. The structure suggested intent, not oversight. Daniel had outlined it in clear terms during their most recent meeting. "This isn't random," he said, sliding the documents across the table. "It's organized, which means it can be dismantled." Tracy had listened without interruption. She did not ask how, she asked when. "Not yet," Daniel had replied. "We need to complete the sequence." Completion. It had become the governing principle. The incident at the gala had already been secured within that structure. The footage existed in multiple forms, angles captured by the venue's internal cameras, fragments recorded by guests whose devices had not been entirely controlled by Sebastian's team. Some of it had been removed from public circulation before it could spread. Not all of it. Enough remained. Enough to establish fact. But fact alone, Tracy understood, did not determine outcome. Context did. And context required alignment between evidence. The video, the financial records, the communication logs, each element needed to support the others without contradiction. That alignment was nearly complete. Nearly. In the days that followed, Sebastian Hale continued to operate within a narrowing margin of control. Externally, his position appeared stable. Public appearances resumed carefully selected and tightly managed. He attended meetings with the same composed authority, reinforcing the perception that nothing fundamental had shifted. Statements released through his office maintained a consistent tone, measured, unbothered, focused on forward movement. The narrative held on the surface. But Tracy had begun to notice the adjustments beneath it. Schedules changed more frequently. Meetings that once occurred in open settings moved to private locations. Communications shortened, became more coded. There were gaps in his calendar that did not correspond to travel or rest. He was adapting, not to the truth, to the possibility of it. One evening, as Tracy reviewed the latest set of documents in the quiet of the living area, her phone vibrated. A message from Daniel. Internal emails secured. Relevant excerpts flagged. Requires review. She opened the file. The correspondence was concise, executive in tone, stripped of unnecessary language. But within that brevity, the connections became clearer. Instructions regarding transfers, references to Clara's entities, discussions of timing that aligned with the financial records already documented. There was no explicit admission. There did not need to be. The implication was sufficient. Tracy read through the exchanges once, then again noting the consistency in language, the repetition of certain phrases, the absence of others. Nothing was accidental. She closed the file and set the phone down. Across the room, the television displayed a segment on market activity. Sebastian's name appeared briefly in the context of an upcoming investment announcement. The tone was neutral, controlled, unaware. Tracy muted the screen. Silence returned. It was within that silence that the final pieces began to settle. The next meeting with Daniel was scheduled for the following morning. When Tracy arrived, the office carried the same quiet order as before. No changes. No visible indication of the progression that had taken place behind closed doors. Daniel greeted her with a nod, gesturing toward the table where the documents had been arranged. "This is the full sequence," he said. No preamble, no framing. Tracy sat her attention moving across the pages. Financial records, email correspondence, video stills time-stamped and cross-referenced. A timeline that connected each element without gaps. She moved through it methodically, not lingering on any single piece, but ensuring that each transition held. When she finished, she looked up. "It's complete," she said. Daniel inclined his head slightly. "Yes." A pause followed. "Then we can proceed." The words carried weight, not urgency, finality. Tracy considered them, not as an invitation, as a threshold. "What are the options?" she asked. Daniel outlined them without embellishment. "Corporate action," he said. "Present the evidence to the board. Immediate impact on his position. Legal filing," he continued. "Financial misconduct supported by documented transactions. That initiates investigation." He paused. "Or both. Coordinated." Tracy listened. Her gaze remained steady. "And the timing?" she asked. Daniel leaned back slightly. "That depends on you." Another pause. "We've reached the point where delay no longer strengthens the case," he added. "It only postpones the outcome." Tracy absorbed the statement. Delay had served its purpose. Completion had been achieved. Now timing would define exposure. She thought of the gala, the silence, the room that had chosen not to act. She thought of Sebastian's certainty in the days that followed, his belief that the narrative had been contained. She thought of the structure now laid out before her, not as fragments, as proof. "Coordinated," she said. Daniel did not ask for clarification. He understood. "Board first," she continued. "Then legal, a sequence, deliberate, controlled." Daniel nodded once. "We'll prepare the presentation," he said. "Confidential distribution, limited access." "And the video?" Tracy asked. "It will be included," he replied. "As supporting evidence. Not as spectacle, as documentation." Tracy stood the decision, settling without visible weight. "There will be resistance," Daniel added. "Of course," she said. He studied her for a moment. "You understand what this will trigger?" It was not a question. It was confirmation. "Yes," Tracy replied. There was no hesitation, because she did not see it as escalation. She saw it as consequence. When she left the office, the city remained unchanged. Movement, noise, continuity. But beneath that surface, a shift had begun. Not visible yet, not acknowledged, but structured. Across the city, Sebastian Hale continued his day as he had planned it. Meetings, calls, appearances, unaware that the system he relied on was no longer stable, because what he had built depended on perception. And perception, once confronted with proof, did not hold. Tracy returned to the car, waiting at the curb, her posture composed, her expression unchanged. She did not check her phone. She did not revisit the documents. She did not need to, because the process had moved beyond preparation. It had entered execution. And execution, once begun, did not reverse. It concluded. The boardroom at Hale Capital was designed to reflect certainty. Glass walls framed a skyline that suggested permanence. A long table of polished stone stretched through the center, its surface unmarked, its symmetry precise. Every chair aligned, every screen calibrated, every detail reinforcing the same message: control. Sebastian Hale entered that room with the expectation that it remained his. He had called the meeting himself, an unscheduled session framed as a strategic review. The timing allowed him to gather the board before external pressure could define the agenda. He intended to move first to shape the discussion, to reaffirm stability before uncertainty could take form. It was how he had always operated. Preemptively, decisively. He took his seat at the head of the table. His posture composed, his expression neutral. Around him, the board members settled into their places with the practiced discretion of individuals accustomed to high-stakes decisions. Some glanced at their devices. Others reviewed prepared notes. A few exchanged brief acknowledgments. No one spoke of the gala. Not directly, but its presence lingered in the room, not as a topic, but as context. Sebastian began without delay. "We have several developments to address," he said, his voice steady, measured, "none of which affect the core stability of this company." The statement was clear, preemptive. He outlined market movements, investment positions, projected growth. His language remained precise, his tone controlled. He moved through the presentation efficiently, reinforcing the narrative he had maintained in the days following the gala. Contained, managed, unchanged. The board listened, some with focus, some with restraint, all with awareness. Because beneath the structure of his presentation, there was an expectation he did not acknowledge. That something else might be introduced. At the far end of the table, a chair remained empty. It did not go unnoticed, but it was not addressed. Not until the door opened. The sound was quiet. But in a room calibrated for precision, it registered immediately. Sebastian's gaze shifted. Not sharply, but enough. Tracy Bryant entered without hesitation. She did not pause at the threshold. She did not seek acknowledgement. She moved directly into the room, her posture upright, her expression unchanged. For a moment, no one spoke, because her presence altered the structure of the meeting in a way that had not been anticipated. Sebastian remained seated. His expression did not change immediately. But something in his posture tightened. "Tracy," he said, his tone controlled. "This isn't." She did not interrupt. She did not respond. Instead, she walked to the empty chair at the end of the table and placed a folder on the surface before her. Then she sat. The movement was simple, deliberate, final. The room adjusted, not visibly, but structurally, because the meeting no longer belonged solely to Sebastian. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze fixed on her. "If you have something to say," he began, "this isn't the forum for—" Tracy opened the folder. The sound of paper against the table was quiet, but it carried. She did not look at him. She looked at the board. "This is documentation," she said. Her voice was calm, even, unraised. It did not compete for attention. It received it. Daniel Cole entered a moment later, closing the door behind him with the same quiet precision. He did not introduce himself immediately. He did not take a central position. He stood slightly behind Tracy, placing additional documents on the table. "Daniel Cole," he said when the room's attention shifted. "Counsel." Sebastian's expression sharpened. "This is inappropriate," he said. "You don't bring legal representation into a board." Daniel did not respond to him. Instead, he addressed the room. "The materials before you outline a sequence of financial transactions connected to Hale Capital," he said. "They have been verified and cross-referenced with internal communications." He paused. "Relevant excerpts are included." A board member near the center of the table reached for the documents. Then another. Pages turned. Quietly, methodically. Sebastian remained still, for a moment. Then he stood. "This is not authorized," he said. "These documents have not been reviewed by—" "They have," Tracy said. She did not raise her voice. She did not look at him. Her gaze remained on the table, carefully. The words settled. Not as a challenge, as a statement. Sebastian's attention moved across the board, searching for alignment, for resistance, for any indication that the structure he had relied on would hold. But the room had shifted. Not dramatically, not visibly, but in the way attention redistributed itself, away from him, toward the documents. A board member cleared his throat. "These transfers," he said, flipping through the pages, "they're routed through secondary entities." Daniel inclined his head slightly. "Correct." Another voice followed. "Whitmore Holdings, yes." Clara's name did not need to be spoken. It was understood. Sebastian's jaw tightened. "This is being misrepresented," he said. "Those structures are standard." "They are not standard in this configuration," Daniel replied. His tone remained neutral, factual, not argumentative, especially when aligned with internal directives. He gestured toward a section of the documents, emails, time-stamped, cross-referenced. The board continued reading. The silence deepened. Not empty, concentrated. Because each page added weight. Each connection reinforced the previous one. Sebastian moved around the table. His movements controlled his focus, shifting between individuals. "You're drawing conclusions from incomplete information," he said. "There are explanations for all of this." No one responded immediately. Not because they agreed, because they were reading, processing, verifying. Tracy remained still. She did not speak. She did not guide the discussion. She allowed the structure to present itself, because it did not require interpretation, only attention. Daniel placed a final document on the table, a still image, time-stamped, from the gala. Sebastian's hand raised, Tracy's position unchanged, the moment captured without sound, without context, but aligned with everything else. The board member nearest the image looked up. Slowly, his gaze moved from the document to Sebastian, then to Tracy, then back to the document. No one spoke, because the room had reached a point where language no longer led. Evidence did. Sebastian exhaled once, controlled, measured. "This is being handled," he said, "externally. There's no need to escalate this internally." The words were precise, calculated. But they arrived too late, because the internal structure had already been engaged. A senior member of the board closed the folder in front of him. The sound was deliberate. "We'll need to review this in full," he said. Not a question, a directive. Another voice followed, immediately. Sebastian remained standing. For the first time, the alignment he expected did not form. Not because it was denied, because it was withheld, pending, conditional. Tracy closed her folder. Her movement mirrored the board members. Quiet, complete. She stood, not as a gesture, as conclusion. "I have nothing further to add," she said. Her voice remained steady, unchanged, because she had not come to argue. She had come to present. And presentation, once complete, did not require reinforcement. Daniel gathered the remaining documents, his movements efficient. The board's attention remained on the materials already before them. Sebastian did not move. He stood at the side of the table, the structure of the room no longer centered around him, because control once questioned did not return immediately. It paused, it recalibrated, or it shifted. Tracy turned toward the door. She did not look back, because she did not need to see the reaction to understand it. The reaction would come, in sequence, in process, in consequence. She stepped out of the boardroom into the corridor beyond. The door closed behind her with the same quiet precision as before. Inside, the meeting continued, but no longer under the same assumptions and no longer under the same control, because the structure had changed, not through force, through proof. The boardroom did not return to its original rhythm after Tracy Bryant stepped out. It held, not in silence, but in a slower, more deliberate movement of thought. Pages remained open. Eyes moved back and forth across columns of numbers, timestamps, and names that no longer functioned as background details. The documents were no longer supplemental. They were central. Sebastian Hale remained standing near the side of the table. His posture controlled his expression, carefully neutral. He did not sit immediately. To do so would have signaled adjustment. He did not adjust. Not yet. "We need to proceed carefully," he said, his voice measured, steady. "These materials haven't been fully contextualized." The words were familiar, structured, intended to slow the pace. Across the table, one of the senior board members, Margaret Ellison, lifted her gaze from the documents. She did not respond to his statement directly. Instead, she asked, "Were these transactions authorized through standard channels?" Her tone was not accusatory. It was precise. Sebastian met her gaze. "Yes," he said. "All movements were approved within the scope of our operational flexibility." Margaret held the silence for a moment longer than expected. "Then the documentation should reflect that clearly," she said. She looked back down at the pages. It doesn't. The room absorbed the statement without reaction, not outwardly, but in the way attention sharpened. Another board member, James Whitaker, leaned forward slightly, adjusting his glasses as he reviewed the email excerpts included in the file. "These instructions," he said, tapping lightly on the paper, reference timing and coordination with external entities. Specifically, Whitmore Holdings. He paused. "Why isn't this disclosed in our internal summaries?" Sebastian's jaw tightened, though his voice remained controlled. "Because Whitmore Holdings operates as an external consulting structure," he replied. "It's not required to be integrated into our internal reporting in that capacity." James nodded slowly. "That may be true in isolation," he said, "but not when it intersects with direct financial routing." He set the document down. "The alignment here suggests something more integrated." Sebastian exhaled once quietly. "You're drawing conclusions from incomplete data," he said again, the phrase repeated, though its impact had diminished. Margaret closed the folder in front of her, her movements deliberate. "Then we complete the data," she said. Not a suggestion, a shift. The room moved with her, not abruptly, but decisively. "We initiate an internal review," she continued, "independent, immediate." Another voice followed. "And suspend related transactions until the review is complete." Sebastian's gaze moved across the table, measuring the distance between his position and theirs. "This is unnecessary," he said. "We can address this through clarification, without disrupting operations." Margaret looked at him directly. "The disruption has already occurred," she said. Her tone did not rise. It did not need to. "Now we determine the extent." The statement settled, not as opposition, as procedure. Across the table, another board member spoke quieter than the others. "There's also the matter of the footage." The word entered the room carefully. Footage. Sebastian did not respond immediately. He did not ask, "What footage?" He knew. Margaret's gaze shifted briefly, then returned to the documents. "Is it part of the record?" she asked. Daniel Cole, still positioned near the end of the room, answered, "Yes." He did not elaborate. He did not describe it. He simply confirmed its existence. Margaret nodded once. "Then it will be reviewed with the rest." No one objected, because by that point objection would have required dismissal of the entire structure already in place. And no one in the room was prepared to do that. Sebastian moved back to his seat, slowly, not as concession, as repositioning. He placed his hands on the table. Fingers aligned his posture, returning to its earlier precision. "If this proceeds," he said, "it needs to remain internal. No external escalation until we've completed our assessment." Margaret considered the statement, then nodded. For now, the condition was clear, temporary, dependent, yet James leaned back slightly, his attention still on the documents. "And Clara Whitmore?" he asked. The name spoken aloud altered the air in the room. Sebastian's gaze sharpened. "She's a consultant," he said. "Nothing more." James did not respond immediately. He flipped to another page. "This suggests otherwise," he said, tapping the reference to Whitmore Holdings again. Silence followed, not uncertain, evaluative, because the connection had been established, not asserted, demonstrated. Sebastian held his position. "She operates independently," he said. "Any overlap is incidental." Margaret closed the final folder. "Then the review will clarify that she said." Again, not a challenge, a process. The meeting did not end with a vote. It did not require one, because the direction had already been set. Internal review, suspension of related transactions, documentation under scrutiny, each step moving forward without the need for unanimous declaration. Sebastian remained at the table as the others began to gather their materials. Conversations resumed in quieter tones, no longer centered around him, but around the documents, the implications, the necessary steps. Margaret approached him briefly before leaving. "This will move quickly," she said, not as warning, as fact. Sebastian met her gaze. "I expect it to," he replied. She nodded once, then turned away. One by one, the board members exited the room. Daniel remained until the end, collecting the remaining materials with careful efficiency. He did not speak to Sebastian. He did not need to. When he finished, he inclined his head slightly and left. The door closed. Sebastian was alone. For the first time since the meeting began, the room returned to stillness. But it was not the same stillness, because the structure had shifted. Not completely, not yet, but enough. He stood slowly, walking to the glass wall that overlooked the city. Below, everything appeared unchanged. Movement continued. Order remained. From that height, disruption was not visible. He understood that perspective. He had relied on it. But now the disruption existed within the structure he controlled. And structures once questioned did not return to certainty without proof. Across the city, Tracy Bryant stepped into the car waiting for her outside the building. She did not ask what had been said after she left. She did not need confirmation, because she understood the process. Evidence had been presented. The system had engaged. Everything that followed would move according to that structure. Not quickly, not loudly, but inevitably. Her phone remained silent in her hand. No messages, no updates, because the next phase did not require communication. It required time. And time, she knew, would do what pressure could not. It would reveal alignment, or the absence of it. As the car pulled away from the curb, Tracy looked out at the city without focus, her expression unchanged. She had not returned to the penthouse since the meeting. She had not contacted Sebastian. There was nothing to say, because the moment for conversation had passed. What remained now was process. And process, once initiated, did not depend on words. It depended on outcome. The shift did not announce itself. It unfolded in filings, in notices, in the quiet movement of documents between offices that did not require public attention to carry authority. 3 days after the board meeting, the first formal action appeared. Not in the press, not in the markets. In a regulatory notice issued without commentary. A review had been opened into financial activity associated with Hale Capital. No accusations, no conclusions, only acknowledgement. Within hours, the second followed. Temporary restrictions placed on specific accounts tied to external entities under review. Whitmore Holdings among them. The language remained precise, measured, but the implications extended beyond the text. Because once a structure entered formal review, it did not remain contained within internal boundaries. It expanded, carefully, systematically. Sebastian Hale received the notifications. In his office, standing at the same desk where he had managed countless negotiations, decisions, and outcomes that reinforced his control. He read each line without interruption. Once, then again. His expression did not change immediately. Years of discipline held. But beneath that stillness, calculation accelerated. He reached for his phone. Calls were made, not to question the process, to understand its reach. Who initiated this, he asked. A pause on the other end. Then, it's tied to the board review. Sebastian exhaled slowly. Not surprise, confirmation. And externally, he continued. Nothing public yet. Yet. The word settled with weight. He ended the call without further comment. Across the office, the screens remained active, displaying market activity that had not yet responded to the shift. Because the shift had not been seen. Not fully. But it would be. In time. Tracy Bryant received the same information through a different channel. Daniel Cole's message arrived without emphasis. Regulatory review initiated. Account restrictions in place. No public disclosure yet. She read it once, then set the phone down. No reaction, because the process had moved exactly as expected. Not accelerated, not delayed, aligned. That afternoon, another message followed. Additional inquiry likely. Prepare for formal proceedings. Tracy did not respond immediately. She walked to the window of the apartment she had not returned to since the board meeting. Not the penthouse. A smaller space. Unremarkable. Unconnected. Temporary. Chosen for its absence of association. The city outside remained consistent. Movement, noise, continuity. But beneath that surface, structures were shifting. She understood that the next phase would not remain internal. It would move outward, into systems that required acknowledgement, legal systems, regulatory bodies, processes that did not respond to influence in the same way Sebastian's networks did. And those systems, once engaged, did not move quickly. But they did not stop. That evening, the first article appeared. Not prominent, not leading, a single column in a financial publication. Regulatory review opens into Hale Capital activity. The language remained cautious. No conclusions, no speculation. But the connection had been made. The review was now visible. Sebastian read it within minutes. He did not react outwardly. Instead, he issued a statement. Short, controlled. We are aware of the review and are cooperating fully. We remain confident in the integrity of our operations. Integrity, confidence, cooperation. The words aligned with expectation. They always did. But this time, they did not hold the same weight. Because the structure supporting them had already been questioned. Clara Whitmore received the news in a different way. Her name had not appeared in the article. Not yet. But the restrictions on Whitmore Holdings had been communicated directly. She called Sebastian, immediately. What is this, she asked. Her voice, usually controlled, carried a sharper edge. A review, he said. Routine. This doesn't look routine, she replied. It will be handled. The phrase repeated. But this time it lacked certainty. Clara did not respond immediately. "Should I be concerned?" she asked. Sebastian paused. Not long, but enough. "No," he said. The answer arrived, but not with the same precision as before. Clara ended the call without further comment, because she understood something he did not. Control did not extend into systems that operated independently, and those systems had begun to move. By the next morning, additional coverage appeared, still measured, still cautious, but expanding. The narrative was no longer contained. It had entered public awareness. Questions followed. Not accusations, not yet, but inquiries. And inquiries once initiated led to investigation. Inside Hale Capital, the shift became visible. Not in dramatic gestures, in adjustments, meetings rescheduled, decisions delayed, communications reviewed with greater scrutiny. Employees who had once operated with confidence now moved with caution, because uncertainty had entered the structure. And uncertainty changed behavior. Sebastian maintained his position. Publicly, internally. He attended meetings, issued directives, reinforced the narrative. But the alignment he had relied on no longer formed as easily. Responses took longer. Questions carried more weight. Silence, when it appeared, meant something different. Across the city, Tracy continued her routine without deviation. She met with Daniel, reviewed updates, confirmed timelines. There was no need for urgency, because the process had moved beyond her control, into systems that would continue regardless. One afternoon, Daniel placed a document before her. "A formal inquiry has been filed," he said. Tracy read the heading. Her name appeared, not as subject, as party. The proceedings had begun. "This will take time," Daniel added. "I understand," she said. He studied her for a moment. "You're prepared for that?" "Yes." Because time, she understood, did not weaken structure. It reinforced it, if the foundation was sound. And theirs was. Sebastian received the same document hours later. His reaction was contained, but sharper. This was no longer review. It was process. Formal, structured, unavoidable. He contacted his legal team immediately. Strategies were discussed, responses outlined, defenses prepared. But for the first time, the process was not entirely within his influence, because it had moved beyond networks, into systems that required proof, and proof, once presented, could not be redefined, only addressed. Tracy did not contact him. She did not respond to his messages, because there was nothing to negotiate, nothing to resolve privately. The moment for that had passed. Now, everything would be resolved through structure, through evidence, through process. As evening settled over the city, the lights reflected again against glass and steel, masking the shifts beneath. But those shifts continued, quietly, consistently, because once the system had engaged, it did not pause. It moved forward, toward conclusion, not with force, with certainty. The proceedings did not arrive with spectacle. They unfolded in scheduled rooms, in controlled language, in documents submitted and reviewed with a precision that did not require attention to carry consequence. The divorce filing came first, not as an announcement, as a formal action entered into the system. Tracy Bryant's name appeared on the document without emphasis. The grounds were listed clearly: irreconcilable differences supported by documented conduct. Attached exhibits referenced the same structure that had been presented to the board: financial records, internal communications, video documentation. Nothing exaggerated, nothing omitted. Sebastian Hale received the filing through his legal team. He read it in his office, the same environment, where he had once assumed control over every outcome that mattered. The language was exact, the tone restrained. There were no accusations framed for impact, no statements designed to provoke response. Only evidence. Organized, sequential, unavoidable. His attorney spoke first. "We'll respond," she said. "There are options." Sebastian did not look up immediately. "What kind of options?" he asked. "Negotiation, settlement, challenge." Each word carried its own structure, its own consequences. Sebastian placed the document on the desk. "We're not conceding anything," he said. The response was immediate, instinctive. Control once threatened moved to reassert itself. His attorney did not disagree, but she did not reinforce the certainty. "We'll review the full scope," she said. "Then we determine position, not outcome." Because outcome, she understood, would not be determined solely by strategy. Across the city, Tracy met with Daniel Cole in a conference room that did not invite interruption. The filing lay between them. Complete, filed, irreversible. Daniel spoke with the same measured tone he had maintained from the beginning. "This initiates the process," he said. "There will be responses, delays, attempts to restructure the narrative." Tracy listened. "They won't change the evidence," she said. "No," Daniel replied, "but they may attempt to reframe it." Tracy nodded once. "Let them." There was no emphasis in her voice, no resistance, because reframing required interpretation, and interpretation could not alter structure. Daniel studied her for a moment. "You understand this will extend beyond the divorce," he said. "Yes." The financial inquiry had already progressed. The regulatory review had expanded. The connection between the two processes was no longer abstract. It was aligned, which meant each would reinforce the other. Clara Whitmore's position shifted more rapidly. Unlike Sebastian, she did not have the same structural protection. Her name appeared in internal inquiries, then in secondary reports, not prominently, but enough. Whitmore Holdings had been identified, its transactions reviewed, its connections mapped. Clara responded by distancing herself, publicly, quietly. Statements were issued through her representatives, limited, cautious, emphasizing her role as a consultant, denying direct involvement in financial decisions. But the documentation did not support that separation. And documentation, once entered into the process, did not respond to statements. It responded to verification. Sebastian reached out to her once more. The call was brief. "We need to stay aligned," he said. Clara's response was slower than before. "I'm reviewing my position," she replied. The shift was subtle, but definitive. Alignment in her terms was no longer assumed. It was conditional. Sebastian ended the call without argument. Because argument did not restore alignment, structure did, and the structure was no longer stable. Within Hale Capital, the internal review concluded. The findings were not released publicly, but they were recorded, distributed, acted upon. Sebastian was asked to step back from operational control. Not removed, not yet, but repositioned, temporarily, pending outcome. The language remained careful. The implication was not. He accepted the decision without visible resistance, because resistance at that stage would have accelerated exposure. He chose containment. Still, Tracy received confirmation through Daniel. "The board has acted," he said. "Limited control, interim oversight." She nodded, no reaction beyond acknowledgement. Because it aligned with the sequence, not the conclusion. The conclusion remained further ahead. The legal proceedings moved at their own pace. Hearings scheduled, documents submitted, responses filed, each step adding to the structure, not altering it. Tracy attended when required, always composed, always silent unless addressed. Her presence did not seek attention. It held it. Because she did not perform. She presented. Sebastian attended as well. His posture remained controlled. His responses measured. He did not engage with Tracy directly. There were no private conversations, no attempts at reconciliation, because the process had removed that possibility. Not emotionally, structurally. One hearing introduced the video, not publicly, within the proceeding. The room remained controlled, limited, but the impact did not require an audience. The footage aligned with the documentation, time-stamped, corroborated, unambiguous. Sebastian did not react visibly, but the shift registered. Because once evidence moved from record to presentation, it no longer remained theoretical. It became active. Clara was called to respond to inquiries. Her statements remained consistent. Limited involvement, no direct knowledge. But the documentation contradicted those claims. Not entirely, but enough. Which meant her position weakened, not suddenly, gradually, the same way the structure had been built. Across these weeks, Richard Bryant remained absent. Not present in any proceeding, not referenced in any document. His influence did not appear, because it had not been used. Tracy maintained that boundary, deliberately, because the process did not require intervention. It required completion. The final stages approached without announcement. No singular moment marked the transition. Only the accumulation of steps that led there. Settlement discussions began, not out of concession, out of recognition. Sebastian's legal team initiated them. The terms were structured, assets divided, control relinquished where required, conditions established. Tracy reviewed them with Daniel. Carefully, line by line, nothing rushed, nothing assumed. When she agreed, it was not with satisfaction, it was with clarity. The marriage as a legal structure would end. The financial consequences would be defined. The remaining processes would continue independently. Sebastian signed shortly after, not as admission, as resolution, because continuation would not alter the outcome, only extend it. Clara's position remained unresolved. Her involvement continued under review, separate but connected. Tracy did not follow that process closely, because it no longer required her attention. Her part had been completed, not entirely, but sufficiently. On the day the divorce was finalized, there was no public statement, no announcement, only a filing, entered, recorded, closed. Tracy left the courthouse without pause. No cameras waited, no reporters gathered. Because the story, as far as the public understood, it had already moved on. But within the system, the conclusion was clear. Not dramatic, not loud, definitive. Sebastian remained within the structure he had once controlled, but no longer at its center, not yet removed entirely, but no longer unchallenged. Tracy did not look back, because there was nothing behind her that required acknowledgement. Only what remained ahead, unstructured, unclaimed, and entirely her own. The hospital room did not carry the weight of the past. It held only what was present. White walls, soft light, the quiet rhythm of monitored breath. Outside, the city moved without interruption, unaware of the moment unfolding within a space that did not invite attention. Tracy Bryant lay still not from exhaustion alone, but from the deliberate stillness she had carried through every stage of the process that had led her here. There were no cameras, no statements, no observers. Only a nurse who moved quietly at the edge of the room, adjusting small details that required no acknowledgement, and the child, wrapped, resting, breathing in a rhythm that did not yet belong to the world beyond that room. Tracy's gaze remained on him, Not searching, not questioning, simply present. Because for the first time in months, there was nothing to assemble, nothing to document, nothing to prepare. The structure she had built had reached its conclusion, not in the way others might have defined it, not through public vindication, not through visible consequence, but through completion. Sebastian Hale no longer occupied a place in her life that required attention. The legal processes had concluded. The financial divisions had been executed. The remaining investigations continued, but without her involvement. She had stepped out of that system, deliberately, without urgency, without hesitation. The nurse approached her voice low. "Would you like anything?" Tracy shook her head once. "No." The nurse nodded and stepped back, allowing the quiet to settle again. Tracy shifted slightly, her hand resting near the edge of the bed. Not reaching, not holding. Close enough. Because presence did not require constant motion. It required continuity. Outside the hospital, the world had already moved on from the story that had once circulated briefly before dissolving into other narratives. The gala had become a reference point for those who remembered. A moment. Not a conclusion. Sebastian's name appeared less frequently in the same context as before. When it did, it was measured, qualified, no longer positioned at the center of certainty. Clara Whitmore's situation had resolved differently. Her name had surfaced more directly in the later stages of the financial inquiry. Statements had been issued, positions redefined, consequences applied. Not dramatically, but definitively. Tracy had not followed those developments closely, because they did not require her attention. They belonged to a system that continued on its own. Richard Bryant had visited once, not immediately, not during the initial hours. He entered the room with the same quiet presence he had maintained throughout her life. No announcement, no display, only arrival. He stood near the foot of the bed, his gaze moving from Tracy to the child, then back again. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he said, "You handled it," not as praise, as acknowledgement. Tracy met his gaze. Yes, there was no elaboration, no recounting of the process, because he understood, and she did not need to explain. He stepped closer, his posture unchanged. "You didn't use anything I offered," he said. "No, not even when it would have been easier." "No." Another pause. Then why? The question was not challenge. It was curiosity. Tracy looked back at the child, then at him. "Because it needed to hold," she said. Richard nodded slowly. He did not ask what she meant. He knew. A structure built through evidence, through process, through systems that did not rely on influence. That was what held. Not pressure, not force, not intervention. He placed a small object on the table beside her. A simple envelope, unmarked. "For him," he said. Tracy did not reach for it. Later she replied. Richard inclined his head slightly. Then he stepped back. He did not stay long. Presence did not require duration. When he left, the room returned to its earlier stillness, unchanged, because nothing had been disrupted, only acknowledged. Zedouan laid days past without urgency. Tracy moved through them with the same measured pace she had applied to everything before. Discharge, return, adjustment. The apartment she chose was not the penthouse, was not connected to Sebastian. It did not carry history. It held only what was necessary: space, light, silence. The child slept, awoke, cried, settled. Rhythms formed, new ones, unrelated to the structures she had left behind. Tracy did not re-enter public spaces immediately. There were no appearances, no interviews, no explanations, because explanation implied justification. and she did not require it. Her decisions had been made within systems that recognized them. That was sufficient. Occasionally, messages arrived. From Daniel, updates, closures, final confirmations that processes had reached their end. She read them, acknowledged them, then set them aside, because closure once achieved did not need to be revisited. One afternoon, weeks later, Tracy stood near the window of the apartment, the child resting quietly in the adjacent room. The city outside remained consistent. Movement, sound, structure. But it no longer defined her position within it. She had stepped outside of that framework, not removed, repositioned, on her own terms. Her phone rested on the table behind her. Silent, unnecessary in that moment. Because there was nothing to manage, nothing to respond to, only continuation. She did not think about the gala, not because she had forgotten, because it no longer held relevance. It had been a point, not a place, a moment that revealed what needed to be seen. Nothing more. She turned away from the window and moved toward the child's room. The door remained open. Light filtered in softly, touching the edge of the crib. The child shifted slightly, then settled. Tracy stood there for a moment, her posture relaxed in a way it had not been before. Not guarded, not observing, simply present, because the process had ended. And what remained did not require strategy, only care. Outside, the city continued. Inside, the space held, not defined by what had been lost or what had been proven, but by what had been built in its place. Quietly, completely, without need for acknowledgement. Tracy Bryant did not look back, not because she refused to, because she did not need to. The past had been resolved. The structure had held, and the future, for the first time, did not depend on anything she had left behind. There are moments that demand a reaction, and there are moments that reveal something deeper than reaction ever could. What happened in that ballroom was not the beginning of Tracy Bryant's strength. It was only the moment the world briefly saw it. She never raised her voice. She never tried to win in the space where she had been diminished. Instead, she chose patience over spectacle, structure over emotion, and proof over performance. And in doing so, she didn't just change her circumstances. She changed the outcome completely. Because real power rarely announces itself in the moment of conflict. It builds quietly in decisions no one sees in discipline. No one applauds. And in truth, that doesn't need to be forced into the light. If you've stayed with this story until now, you understand that silence isn't always weakness, and control isn't always where it appears to be. I'd like to know where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Stories like this travel far, and every place adds a different meaning. And if this kind of story where justice unfolds slowly and strength speaks without words means something to you, you're welcome to stay for more. There are many stories like this still waiting to be told.